to be in that mold that, society tells us that we're going to be in, and that there's so much messaging around that if you're thin, you're going to be healthier and, more desirable, you're going to be more accepted, more lovable. Like there's so much around it. And I get it. It's a very tempting, especially the marketing around the GLP-1s that tells us here, this thing that you've always wanted, that we've kind of said you have to accept your body because there's no other way to get there. Now, like you said, people can just take this injection and lose weight. And I think my concern is that there's so much that we don't know about what's going to happen long term.
Hi, Nina.
Hi, Jenny.
Well, welcome, everyone. Our guest today is Dr. Alexis Conason. She is a clinical psychologist and certified eating disorder specialist consultant. She is the author of a wonderful book, The Diet-Free Revolution: 10 Steps to Free Yourself from the Diet Cycle with Mindful Eating and Radical Acceptance. There's so many words in there that we want to know about. She is the creator of the Anti-Diet Plan, which is an online mindful eating program designed to help people stop dieting. And she is, of course, a fierce advocate for body liberation. It's why she's on our show today, among other reasons. And Dr. Conason helps people challenge harmful cultural norms around weight, health, and worth, which is exactly what our show is about, which is why she's with us. So welcome, Alexis.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited.
It's our pleasure. We love to start with a question, which is, how did you get into this field? How did you sort of find your way into the work that you do?
Well, I mean, in some ways, I would say it started when I was a kid and just inundated with diet culture, and like so many of us, constantly trying to change my body and, feeling like there was something wrong with me, that I couldn't just, do this thing that it seemed like everyone else was doing, which was to lose weight and keep it off. So that evolved into my interest in psychology. And I really started off my career thinking that I was going to be a weight loss therapist and help people lose weight. And it wasn't until I opened my practice, thankfully pretty early in my journey, that I got introduced to the health at every size movement and weight inclusivity. And, from there, I just started really looking at the research and doing a lot of unlearning at that time. I was actually working in obesity research, quote unquote obesity research, when I got exposed to the health at every size messaging. I was at a mindful eating workshop that ended up being kind of diety in and of itself. And I didn't know any difference. That's, what I was bought into. But there was a contingent of folks from the health at every size movement there that it was like a revolt at the workshop. And I was like, what? I had never heard of this. So when people started talking about, diets don't work, weight loss doesn't, work a long time, that was really the first time I had ever heard those messages. I think it's so different now for people coming out of school because the conversation has become a lot more mainstream. But at that time, it had literally never occurred to me to question that kind of weight normative model.
And Alexis, that's so important to stop and pause and notice that that's true for many people, that there's no stopping to notice that going and being restrictive and dieting and being tight around food and critical to our body, that feels like the norm. And so that moment of there's a different way here, maybe, is a very powerful moment to stop and go, how do you think, I know you were in a clinical setting, but how do we help our clients? How do we help women who are like, no, this is the way, and I have bought into the way? How do we help clients make that dramatic, oh, there's something else possible here?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it really is different for each person. Like for me, I was working in research in the time. I was kind of like a sciencey kind of person, like in terms of that's what I believed in. So, for me, it was really a process of understanding the research and understanding kind of the scientific backing behind the idea that the weight normative model doesn't actually have a lot of support for being effective. And that when we look at things like improving health behaviors or eating more mindfully or intuitively, there's more support behind that. And it just also started to instinctively kind of like make more sense. Like if you want to improve your health, focus on improving your health, not losing weight. Like it makes a lot of, it's kind of common sense, which is when you're immersed in the diet mentality, I think sometimes we lose sight of common sense. Um, but not everybody's a research person. So I don't think everybody needs that. And I think for a lot of people, it's just kind of helping validate their own lived experiences. Like when I started, for myself personally, when I started to kind of toy with the idea that diets don't work, it made sense to me because it had never worked for me. That was my experience. I had struggled so much of my life. So, for many people, like with a lot of my clients, I like to kind of, give it back to them in the way of just like, well, how is that working for you? And,
Yeah.
Mhm.
clearly if they found their way into our offices, it's usually not working so great.
I love that you have a foot in research and a foot in clinical. I saw recently, because you're very active on social media, that you were either pointing out or talking about an article that I think was in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism. And I think it had, for what us was not a surprising conclusion, but I think for the field that was reading this article was a surprising conclusion. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so that research was really highlighting some of the risks of weight cycling, and that weight cycling is associated with increased risks of, several different health conditions. So that's something that's been shown before, the health impacts of weight cycling and also the health impacts of internalized weight bias. So, a lot of the things that we attribute to being in a larger body, we have to also look at what is the health impact for people who are in a larger body who have also been told to lose weight for most of their lives and who have gone through numerous periods of weight cycling and also have higher levels of internalized weight stigma. And a lot of the medical conditions that we associate with higher BMI are actually found to be associated with things like weight cycling and internalized weight bias.
We want to say that again loud and clear and slowly, right? So if I heard you, a lot of the ailments, the issues, the problems, even the medical sequela that we think we associate with being in a larger body is not from that, but more so because people have been up and down and up and down and up and down so many times. And if I extrapolate from that, um, it's better to just stay where you are, wherever that is. Just kind of stay kind of within a very small range of where you are rather than trying to chase the rabbit.
Yeah, I would say the research says that's a strong possibility. And, that when we can be at a stable weight and also have a healthier relationship with food, not be dealing with chronic stress that often happens when we're hating our body and trying to lose weight, that also has an impact on our body too. So I think that if we can kind of create more peace within ourselves, that goes a long way in terms of health.
Yeah. And I want to just one line it, which I know, Alexis, is your message is diets not only don't work, but they actually cause harm. And I think that's so important. Like in all the research that you are quoting and all the research in the study, it's not just that you're going to gain the weight back, it's actually going to do something bad. And we kind of need to get that in everybody's head because the whole world is saying, no, no, if you do these things, you're doing something good for yourself.
Well, I think our culture has embraced this thin at any cost mentality. And, I think that a lot of the times we see people doing really unhealthy things in an attempt to lose weight, thinking that if they can just lose weight, it doesn't really matter what they're doing, that's going to improve health. And I think that's a huge disservice that the, kind of mainstream medical industry has done for our culture, for people.
So it's funny that you say this. So I know that all three of us, see patients and clients, right? And I'm wondering if you're experiencing the phenomenon that I'm experiencing, which is it took long enough to get people to the idea of, well, you know what? this wonderful body of mine, the body that has really produced miracles in so many ways, if I could be a friend to it, if I could be nicer to it, if I could love it, gee, wouldn't life be better, no matter what its size? And now we have those same people coming in saying, well, you know what? So listen, I tried that, and here's what I found out. Actually, I can just take a GLP-1 injectable for the rest of my life, and I don't have to do any of that because really, I mean, I appreciate the principles, and certainly the work has been worthwhile. But here's the thing, I can just finally be in the body I've wanted to be in like my whole life, and it looks like I'm just going to be able to stay there. And I want to put out there something that Nina and I have said many, many times before, which is above all body autonomy. People get to do whatever they want. We have no judgments. But this is a really fascinating phenomenon that's occurring, and I'm wondering if it's something you're interacting with.
Yeah, we're definitely seeing a lot of it in my practice, and also I'm seeing a lot of it just on social media, like, and I get it because body acceptance is a really hard journey, and I think that a lot of people have done a lot of work trying to get there. I find that with a lot of clients and just people in general that I talk to, like, even if we've done a lot of work on body acceptance and healing from an eating disorder, especially, it's like the rational part of our brain accepts it. Like you said, like people agree with the principles. It's oftentimes very much like values aligned with ourselves. But there's still this really strong, deeply rooted emotional piece that wants to fit in, that wants to, kind of be able to,
Belong.
yeah. Yeah, to be in that mold that, society tells us that we're gonna be in and that there's so much messaging around that if you're thin, you're going to be healthier and, more desirable, you're gonna be more accepted, more lovable. Like there's so much around it. And I get it. It's a very tempting, especially the marketing around the GLP-1s that tells us here, this thing that you've always wanted that we've kind of said you have to accept your body because there's no other way to get there. Now, like you said, people can just take this injection and lose weight. And I think my concern is that there's so much that we don't know about what's going to happen long term because, like you said, Jenny, like people are recommended to stay on these medications lifelong. I think that's something that people often don't really understand. Even the doctors that I'm seeing prescribe it are kind of telling people go on it for a few months, lose some weight, and then go off of it. And that is not the recommendation for how these medications work. They're supposed to be on it lifelong, oftentimes at higher doses. And there's just not a ton of research about what happens over the lifespan.
One of the things that you said around social media and the pressure of social media, because I on purpose go and see like what's the messaging around GLP-1s on social media? What's the messaging of dieting right now? Because that's what our clients are really hearing. But one of the things that I'm seeing so much in the GLP-1 world is everybody who's it's working for. But what am I seeing in my practice are the people who go, I tried it, it's not working. Now I don't even know what to do with myself when I'm hungry. I don't can't navigate my way around hunger and fullness. I've lost my cues, right? I'm feeling bad part of the week, right? There's a lot that we're not hearing in the rhetoric in our culture right now around GLP-1s because they're being touted as the be all, the answer, the gold star. But what we don't hear are the people who dropped out of the study, the people who it's not working for, the people who've tried 3 different ones, the people whose digestions are terrible, the people who have ended up in the hospital. Now, again, I'm going to come back to what Jenny and I always say. You can do whatever the heck you want with your body. That's body autonomy. It's your choice. But, our perspective is eyes wide open.
Yeah, I agree completely. And also, the people who are developing eating disorders, being on these medications. I think that's something else that's often not talked about. And we're seeing a lot of folks developing very restrictive eating disorders that kind of go unnoticed or even applauded because they're losing weight.
Mostly applauded. Mostly applauded. Yeah, because the thinking is like, "Oh, isn't this great? Look how much control she has, like, she leaves food over." Well, I hope she's leaving food over because she's not hungry anymore in a natural way, not because, well, the drug stops me from eating. Okay. Whatever works, right? Alexis, I noticed in the title of your book, The Diet Free Revolution, which is very excellent, by the way, that you made it a point to use in your subtitle radical self acceptance. It's a wonderful term. Tell us what you mean by that. What does that embody?
So, radical self acceptance is the idea of accepting ourselves exactly as we are in this moment. And I think there's so much misunderstanding around acceptance. And I really like to clarify acceptance doesn't mean that you have to like yourself. It certainly doesn't mean you have to like the way that you look. It means that we are opening our eyes to the reality of things as they are in this current moment. So, radical self acceptance would be opening our eyes to the reality as we are in this moment and trying to find ways to move forward with compassion.
I love that. This is what is right now. That's what you're saying acceptance is.
Yeah, and how can we best take care of ourselves from this place?
I think it's important to say, too, that acceptance isn't settling. And acceptance isn't just, rolling with it. Acceptance is really like a statement that you make to yourself. This is who I am in this moment. Now let me take a look. And by the way, this is who I am in this moment. Um, and while I'm at it, look at the things I've accomplished. Look at the things this body has accomplished. This body that I keep torturing, that I keep fighting, that I keep hating, by the way, has taken me through, A to Z, whatever that list may be. So, in your practice, which I know is a thriving center in New York, how do you help folks get through some of those conversations? And are you seeing anything that is sort of generational, age specific? I mean, if you're starting to work with someone at 23, is that any different than at 43 and 63? I mean, what's your experience?
Yeah, I think that in terms of the age ranges, the exposure to like diet culture and but what we could call body positivity is so different generationally. Like my generation, I'm 43. Like my generation and certainly for like people older than me and maybe a little bit younger, we really grew up in this no questioning diet culture. Like there was no one blinked an eye when you said, you were going to lose weight for your upcoming vacation or that you weren't, eating carbs at dinner. Like this was the norm. Everyone was doing it. My parents were both big into dieting, and I don't think there was ever a question that that could be giving harmful messages to children. It was just there was no awareness of it. And I think that when I see younger people, especially like younger professionals coming out of school, they've gotten, there's some questioning of the weight norms. I don't think we're there. And certainly I think there's a big backslide that's happening now with what I'm calling the Ozempic era. But I think that the conversation is so different that people are raised with the duality of it. And I think that there's for a time in there was a generation or some years that people really raised with a lot more acceptance of different ways of being about a lot of different things, including body size. Again, I think we've taken a back step recently, but
There was
yeah.
a moment there. There was a moment there where it was like, oh, the fat activist movement was gaining traction. The body positivity movement was gaining traction. People being accepting of different sizes, people walking around beaches more proudly in their body. I felt like there was a nanosecond we had. And then it
Maybe a
all
nanosecond.
maybe a
Right.
nanosecond. I find it there's some grief there for me because I felt like we had a glimpse, and then the GLP-1s came, and again, you can do what you want, and for some people, these are amazing things, and some people, they're very harmful, but what it did culturally is took the idea that being in a larger body was okay off the table, and that's painful.
We'd be remiss if we didn't mention, Alexis, that your dear sweet husband is Dr. Gregory Dodell, who is, at least in our neck of the woods, a very, very well-known endocrinologist in New York. And, God bless endocrinologists, right? And they all mean well, and they all went through a lot of training. And not your husband, but others can do harm because they are steeped in diet culture. They are steeped in weight stigma. And I understand you might have had a hand in showing him the way, because I know that his practice is so devoted to this now. Can you take us a little bit into that journey?
Yeah, so it was actually a lot of change happened around when I was writing my book. But when my husband and I were first dating, married, we were both working. This isn't how we met, but coincidentally, we were both working he was doing his training in endocrinology in the same department that I was doing obesity research in. We were both in the New York Obesity Research Center. At the time, was part of Columbia University, and this was the world we were both immersed in, going to obesity conferences, lectures, research, workshops, research. And as I started learning, we were together when I started learning about weight inclusivity. And I started, talking to him about what I was learning, as you do with a spouse or partner. And, he was skeptical, and he kind of, over the years, the more that we talked about it, inched a little bit closer. And I think he kind of got stuck for a while, where a lot of us do, where we're one foot in and one foot out, kind of, um,
The yes,
you
but.
know, yeah, yes, but it was actually when I was writing my book, and it was a very intensive process, really. And again, for me, I included a lot of the research in my book because that was one of the things that was meaningful for me in making the perspective shift. And I, asked him to read everything and give me his input. And he says that it was really reading the research condensed, kind of compiled in that way, that was what brought him both feet over to the other side. So, yes, I'm very happy that New York has a weight inclusive endocrinologist. Most states can't say that.
Yes, I'm very happy because I'm in New York and that's where my folks are. So, how do we get your book to be part of, medical school curricula? I think that would be a great
I think
idea.
that would be important.
Well, I would be thrilled for that. And I don't necessarily think it has to be in my book, but I would, for a long time, I've been really thinking about that question, because I think that's where change happens. I think that in the medical system, a lot of it is top down in terms of what is being taught, what is going on with like the guidelines that are disseminated. And by the way, when you look at the committees putting together these guidelines, oftentimes there's a lot of involvement from people who are getting money from the drug companies. And, so it's like we don't always realize where all of our information and these guidelines are coming from. So that gets disseminated down to doctors, to medical students, to training. And I think that we could have such an impact if we could get some kind of curriculum in medical schools, in residency, around weight inclusive approaches to care. And I think it would be really helpful for doctors as well, because I think that a lot of doctors get stuck in a system that doesn't necessarily reward good medical care, where they're seeing a ton of patients with very short periods of time, and they're being taught tools that don't necessarily really work, especially when it comes around food, weight, body image, eating disorders, all that kind of stuff. They're not taught really anything about eating disorders. So I think if we were able to empower physicians with tools that actually are effective in terms of how to talk to patients around health in ways that don't feel stigmatizing, where they'll have more positive interactions with their clients. Like Greg comes home all the time and tells me, how meaningful it is that he can have these positive interactions with patients, and people are so grateful to be able to have their diabetes care, their PCOS, their endocrine conditions addressed through a weight inclusive lens. So I think if we could, give doctors those tools that are more effective, they can feel like they're making a difference, having more positive interactions with people. And I think everyone's happier and better off.
The thing that I really want to go back is the very beginning, where you said much of this information is being disseminated by people who have a certain vested interest that isn't necessarily our actual sense of well-being in our body. It's their own interests and their own money. It's like the follow the money piece.
Well, so that's sort of what I was gonna get to also, which is there's this conundrum, right? What you said was so, important, Alexis, which is that your husband, a physician, a researcher, reads this condensed research and said, "Oh, well, wait a second, that makes sense," right? So, A, how do you put this kind of research and more research in front of the right eyes, right? And how do you fund that research if those who are doing the research have sort of a vested interest in some other points of view? I also think that one of the ways we've all sort of been able to impact the medical community, I think we both have done this, is to do a talk at Grand Rounds, is to come and just start to open up this conversation. Because I think for the medical community, all parts of it, to really incorporate this, they also have to be willing to take a look at their own values around this, their own views of it, their own views of their own bodies, the things that they thought just, have made them tick every day. And we're not asking them to turn themselves inside out. It's just to say, well, okay, this has worked for me, and there are others that have a very, very different experience.
Well, Jenny, as I hear you talk and Alexis talk, I'm like, "Oh, how do we organize like a subcommittee of professionals that do what we do so that go and say, look, we have this piece of curriculum and we have all these experts. How do you want us to plug in? Right? How can we plug in? How can we impact the education that's happening right now?"
Well, I mean, there are professional organizations, of course, that we all belong to where we try to go to some symposia and see what the current research is, and that's sort of like, speaking to the converted. So then it's about how do we disseminate it out into the larger community. That's what you're asking, right? Alexis, to bring this back to your wonderful book, you talk about 10 steps to freeing yourself from the diet cycle. Can you take us through a few of them? I mean, one of them I think you say is to say goodbye to dieting. Now that's almost sounds obvious, right? But it's a big step, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a big step. And I think it's something that's missing in a lot of mindful eating programs. One of the reasons I wrote this book when I started, trying to get this book out there and first had the idea for the book, there was really, and I think there still is when you talk about mindful eating, very little that's written out there from a truly kind of weight inclusive anti diet perspective. A lot of mindful eating gets co opted by the diet industry. We hear a lot about mindful eating as being like a way to lose weight or a trick, ways to trick your body into feeling satisfied with an apple or, very little food. And that's so not what mindful eating is about. And I think that when you haven't given up the diet mentality, it really does, mindful eating does become like almost like another diet. So what I have found through my work for, I don't know, almost 15 years with clients, is that when we're still immersed in diet mentality, it's very hard to listen to your body because you're constantly mistrusting yourself. So, you're experiencing hunger, you're craving, maybe a cookie or you're craving something sweet. And your initial thought is, I shouldn't eat that. I shouldn't be hungry now. If I eat that, I'm not going to lose weight. So, how can we really listen to and honor our body when we're constantly mistrusting ourselves? So, I think kind of the foundation to healing our relationship with food and with mindful eating really is to like understand that what we've been taught around dieting and weight and health, like a lot of that stuff is actually not true, and here are the things that are true. If you're concerned about your health, here are the things that we can do that can help us care for ourselves, because I don't think that turning away from diet culture means that you're giving up on yourself or that you don't care about your health. In fact, I think it's just the opposite. Like, I think health comes from that place of being compassionate towards yourself and finding out how to truly, like improve your health and care for yourself. So I think that's really the foundation. And that piece can be really hard. Like in therapy, I spend a lot of time with time with folks, like unpacking the narratives that they've been taught around their body, what it means, even going back to family of origin, family stories of what does it mean not to diet, if that was a way of identification with your family, a way of approval. I think that there's so much that gets caught up in all of that, the trauma that we've, experienced around our bodies. So there can be a lot of processing in therapy around that. And, the book obviously is not a replacement for therapy. It's really designed to be a supplement or for people who can't access therapy. But, you know, I think that if we can really truly understand that dieting, and that restrictive mentality around food is not serving us, that's a good place to start for the next steps around mindful eating.
Yeah, I think one of the things you said that was really beautiful and elegant is the cost of letting go of dieting, right? That sense of, oh, as a family, we diet, right? I see it in for clients around their community of women friends. Well, what we do is we go on a diet together, right? That was true for me. I had a friend. How did I see her every week? We went to Weight Watchers together, right? So, what does that mean to let go of dieting? Not just because we know that actually we're more likely to play out self-supporting behaviors when we're not dieting and have a compassionate relationship, but how do we let go of it when it's been part of our identity and part of our community, part of connection? It's a really tender part of the process to look at.
And I think there's a lot of grief that can come up in that process, especially around the fantasy of dieting and what we think we're going to gain if we can just, lose the weight. It's like, as much as dieting and the diet cycle, tortures so many of us, it also holds out hope that if we can just figure out how to do this thing, then we'll get this like great life at the end of the rainbow. And when we give up dieting, we're also giving up the fantasy of all the things that we thought that dieting was going to bring us.
Yes, and it brings us back to the most basic statement, right? Which is, oh, right, thin is good, bigger isn't, fat is bad. And so that's the starting point, that's the goal. Um, you know, I love this expression that you use in the book, which is embracing your yum. So, can you tell us what that means? And I'm also curious to know if that relates at all to the fact, and I hope I'm not revealing anything here, that you have some young children, and I'm wondering what it's like to introduce them to this in this very organic, natural way, because this is just who you are and what you do.
Yeah. So embrace your yum is really the idea of tuning into taste and, eating foods that are enjoyable to us and mindful eating. That's part, I think a lot of people think that not dieting is just about eating all the foods that we're not supposed to eat when we're on a diet. And actually, it's really a very discerning process of tuning into what we actually want in terms of hunger, fullness, taste, embracing our yum, and also paying attention to how different foods make us feel. So those are all elements of like how we can make choices around food. And having young kids, it's just fascinating. And I think as a psychologist who's, does this professionally, it challenges challenges me in so many ways because you think you're just gonna, do it all perfectly and be immune from all of those, parenting stumbles that most of us make around, especially around food. But it's interesting and challenging. And my older daughter is a pretty selective eater. So, we're on that journey of terms of trying to just like let it go and not, she gets enough nutrition. So just, letting go those preconceptions of what we think eating should be like and watching our kids, it's a little scary. Like it's scary when we try to trust ourselves and it's scary as a parent to just let your kids, know that they have the wisdom. But we really, we definitely try to avoid any, we don't have any like diet talk or restrictions or rules around food. But it just brings up all the stuff.
I mean, no one ever wants to throw parents under the bus. It's the hardest job on the planet, right? And, everybody means to do the right thing. And we're all sort of subject to however we were raised. And so that's sort of something that enters the picture. And then It's about, okay, can I really take a look here and say, what about that works? And what about that really actually doesn't work? And then your approach with your kids sounds, lovely. They're very lucky to be exposed to that so early.
But I think as parents, it's so much about healing our own stuff. And, again, even as someone who's done, so much work on myself and professionally in this area, it's still like, oh, those things still pop up here and there. And but I think that so much of what our kids take is how, and there's research on this too, that how we as parents feel about our own bodies and treat our own bodies has an incredibly huge impact on our kids. So, growing up, like my mom never told me to go on a diet. She never restricted what I was eating, but I saw her always on a diet and always not feeling happy about her body and saying that she needed to be thinner. And I picked up on those messages and knew, I grew up thinking that's what women do is they diet and they try to be smaller. And also, I think that often as kids, we see our parents' bodies, and if they're not happy with their body and we came from them, in so many ways, like, what does that mean about our own bodies?
Right, and that is a whole other podcast around that dynamic of how our parents impact us and how we impact our kids, and also how our kids are watching us, but they're watching the world treat their parents, right? There's so many dynamics at play there, but the most important thing that you said is if you want to raise kids who feel at home in their own skin, do your work. So I'm aware that we're coming up to the end of our time together, and there's two things that I want to ask you. One is, what do you want people to know? What do you want people to know? And sort of connected to this, and this may be the way you answer, is that young self that started dieting before you had written this book, if you could have said, or after you had written this book, if you could have said something to her, what would you have said?
That you're okay the way you are.
Hmm.
That's the message that I needed to hear. I think that's the message that so many of us, even as adults, need to hear. We are raised with such a deep sense of shame, and we get that message from so many different, avenues in our society. And I think that we spend so much of our time and energy trying to change ourselves to feel okay, right? And I mean, in so many ways, that's what dieting is about, right? Like, how can we change ourselves so that we feel acceptable to the world and that we feel at least a little bit more okay inside. And dieting doesn't get us there usually, which is why it becomes really an endless cycle that can very easily evolve into a dangerous cycle around eating disorders as well. But yeah, that's the one thing. My book is dedicated to my two daughters, and I say, I hope you always know you're good enough exactly as you are. And that's what I would want everyone to know.
Hmm.
We would want everybody to know that too,
Yes.
despite the messages they may get elsewhere. I have one final question. Um, what to do when the biggest offender about this is a medical professional, someone who you've come to trust or you've come to for whatever the reason. I ask this because as I look at my own journey, right, the aha moment for me, this goes back a very long time, was I was told I needed some knee surgery. Turns out, by the way, I didn't, but I was told I needed knee surgery. And by the way, it would have a better outcome if if I would lose some weight. And I bought that hook, line, and sinker, and I kept trying to make the argument, well, it makes sense, right? It's physics. Like, yes, if you're lighter than your frame, and only to come to understand that that's absolutely not true. And so now, if someone were to have told me that, I would say, okay, thanks. And I'm just curious, if someone came into your office with the exact same condition I have in my knee, and they were in what you consider a smaller body, what would you tell them? Because that's what I want to hear, right? So I'm just curious, how you help folks navigate that piece of things. Not to vilify the medical community, but there are those who just don't know what they don't know.
And that's one of my favorite things for people to ask medical professionals is, do you ever see this in people in a thinner body? And if so, what advice do you give? What treatment do you do? Because that's what I want. It's so difficult, and like I said, there's so much bias. I mean, again, going back to research, so I'm kind of a research person, like, doctors, I think, are the number 2 offender of weight stigma, or the number 2 perpetrators of weight stigma. Number 1 is families, and that is taught. Like, if you look at, surveys of medical students, like, already they're internalizing beliefs around fat patients as being a waste of their time, being, a nuisance, a burden, they don't wanna work with them, and doctors are not taught how to treat people in larger bodies, and I think that's the biggest problem, because, or one of the biggest problems, because then they see people in a larger body as hopeless, less treatable, again, a waste of their time. When imagine a world where doctors were only trained in how to treat people in larger bodies. Then it would be the thin people who are a nuisance because they wouldn't know how to operate or to treat them. So, the weight bias is just so prevalent in the medical industry, and it's taught top down in addition to what doctors as human beings internalize just from being part of our culture. It feels like such an uphill battle, and it's so frustrating because when patients go in to see a doctor, they're in a vulnerable position. They're looking for help, they're looking to this person as an expert, and a lot of people don't question what doctors tell them. They don't realize that the guidelines that these doctors are going based on are influenced by big pharma or, financial interests and things like that. So a lot of people are taught to just, accept wholeheartedly the advice that doctors give them. And there's a cultural piece there too. So, I'm sure you've had the experience, I think we all have as therapists, working with folks, doing a lot of work on body image, eating disorder recovery, only for them to, go into a doctor's office, months, a year later and be told to lose weight. And it's like, oh, like this huge backslide now. So, the easy advice to give to people is to find weight inclusive medical doctors. In practice, that's really hard to do because there are very few, and they are hard to find.
Right. And in the absence of that, I would say the one other thing to do is to listen to everything you're told clinically. I mean, unless you're in an emergency situation, with curiosity and to ask questions, to just ask questions because you and your doctor can somehow sometimes find another route, another way to get to something just by curiosity, right? Yeah.
If the doctor has time for that, because I think that what a lot of people report is that people come out of medical appointments feeling very unsatisfied and rushed off.
Unseen, unheard.
Yeah, I think we need, just a complete overhaul of the medical industry, which is not
Well, I'm glad you said it because now your husband can be upset with you and not us, but okay. So I want to remind everybody that your wonderful book is The Diet-Free Revolution, 10 Steps to Free Yourself from the Diet Cycle with Mindful Eating and Radical Acceptance. Alexis, it's always a phenomenal pleasure to spend time with you. We're so grateful that you were with us, and thanks for your wisdom.
Thank you.
Thank you. This was a great conversation. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you.